Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Adrienne Arnold. I'm the business manager at AEL Environment. Just before we get started, I wanted to just take a moment to recognize the land that we are on is still home to Indigenous people, the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And it's a privilege to work in a field that allows us to help restore some of the damage that has been done to this land. Our presentation is about 40 minutes, so we will be following it by 20 minutes of question and answer at the end. And your presenters are two people that I respect greatly for their knowledge in the field. We have Paul Wilson, he's a senior engineer at AEL Environment, and we have Kevin Beaudry. He's a partner and sales rep at Ellington Partners. Please feel free to use the chat bar to communicate with us during the presentation. We will be monitoring it. We welcome all your questions. Please feel free to type your questions throughout the chat and I'll try to interject. We're trying to hope to keep it a little more casual, a bit more of a conversation style. So I'll try to interject with your questions to Paul and Kevin. But if we don't get there, we'll address them in the Q&A. When the seminar closes, there'll be a prompt 3-minute feedback survey, and we really appreciate any of your input. And additionally, we'll be sharing an on-demand recording of the webinar when it's available. So I'll pass it off to Kevin and Paul to get started.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. If we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So as Adrienne mentioned, welcome to our December podcast in terms of looking for, again, practical solutions to real estate transfer assessment, remediation, and ongoing operation. So I work for AEL Environment. Our specialty is in the science that goes behind environmental science, site assessments, and remediation work. We look at, rather than just pure science, we try and match up that science with innovative land restoration solutions so that you have a better idea about where you're going with all of this science work and how it can help you. And hopefully this podcast will give you more information on how we do that. Next slide.
Good day, everybody. Kevin Beaudry here. I work for Ellington Partners, as Adrienne noticed off the top. Been practicing for over 25 years nationally, looking after both owners, tenants, and investors, mostly corporate owners who are acquiring or disposing of real estate across the country. Probably known Paul now for an excess of 10 years. Worked on a lot of interesting situations, some of which we'll talk about today. I want to thank AEL for putting this on and the hard work to put the slides together and do this event. We've got about 30 slides to go through, so a minute per slide for those of you who are counting. But hopefully we've got some key takeaways. I know it's a varied audience, different skill sets. Some of it may be boring and repeat for others. So hopefully there's a few takeaways for anyone else who's got a little bit more depth of experience in these matters. So next slide, Adrienne, and I'll just set up the context. Again, we're going to try to keep it very casual. And for those of you who've been zooming a little bit in the last 6 months, if you encourage the use of the chat box, just the way we have this set up, the more questions and engagement we have, the better we can focus on any questions you might have before we get to the end. The setup today is basically a combination of Paul, who is the very deep and diligent scientist behind all of this, and then my counterbalance to that is more of, okay, what does it mean? And I loosely say, like literally in kindergarten, what does it mean? Because it's a complex issue. But the context is in respect of real estate life cycle, end to end here, acquisition, operation, and sort of disposition. Our comments, in particular mine, are more about thinking of an environmental support team like an accountant, a lawyer, or a banker. Don't wait until the last minute to get 3 quotes for a phase 1 or a phase 2 or any environmental. Think it through, maybe have annual reviews. But in the context of, again, that you could be acquiring on a specific project, be operating for 3 years, 10 years, 100 years, and always make your decisions with an exit strategy in mind. You'll hear me repeat that over and over again. So again, if the practice that you're in day to day involves the selling, leasing, occupancy, disposing by way of a sublease, potential sale of business, a merger and acquisition, a renovation. All of these things take a lot of time, and particularly in this new environment we're in, and both in terms of supply side problems on the real estate and bureaucratic slowdowns with respect to the pandemic and everything else going on. Being organized is critical. That's my opening speech, Paul. So I'll let Paul, next slide, I'll let Paul say, okay, and get into the, what does it all mean from an environmental knowledge perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So we consider ourselves to be essentially knowledge brokers. So we collect information on a site. We put that into a standardized format, and then we present that to our clients in a way that they can hopefully understand, but more importantly, in that context, understand what the practical implications of that are. So in this context, we're talking about real estate transfers. So what does due diligence look like? If we can go to the next slide. So during acquisition and disposal, you have two key environmental site assessment reports. I think most of us are probably familiar with those now. A phase one ESA really asks the question, are there any risks with respect to value? So we look at not just the property, but the area surrounding the property, neighboring properties, what the impact they might have on it, because contamination has no boundaries. That's an important step in any kind of site assessment. So the question is, are there any risks to value? And the way we contextualize that statement is we follow the standard that says, with respect to environmental site assessments, do you have areas of potential environmental concern? And in a phase one, the key element is the word potential. So they look at the historic research, whether that's fire insurance maps or air photos or spills records or owner interviews, those kinds of things, and comes up with those areas of potential environmental concern. And then with respect to the phase two, what the phase two does.
Paul, can I jump in for just a sec?
Sure.
Can you, we had a question about if a phase one would typically include asbestos issues?
There's a bunch of different things that can come into play on a phase one. We'll focus in this presentation mostly with the risks that happen below ground, but there are other risks in terms of due diligence, and those risks have to do with building condition audits. So things like what's the condition of the roof, what's the condition of the building envelope, maybe the pavements come into play on that, mechanical, electrical equipment, and then as the position was raised, what happens with respect to hazardous materials, and that's another element of the environmental site work that can be included and is generally part of it. Sometimes you can avoid those kinds of things depending on the age of the structure, since asbestos was phased out of use during a certain time period, as was PCBs. But we look at what those impacts might be. And so the short answer is, yeah, that can be part of the assessment. So we take those areas of potential environmental concern. Most of the ones we'll talk about again are below ground. And then we also include the ones that actually may turn into not just potential, but actual environmental risks. And the way we do that is through a phase two, and that's just simply taking some soil and groundwater samples, putting in a well so we can get those water samples, and then taking those samples to the lab and finding out if they're above or below a stated criteria for that site. So the phase two basically says, is the potential risk a real risk? And after that's completed, then we can start to provide input. Obviously, our best outcome is a clean phase one or a clean phase two. To be perfectly honest, you hardly ever get those these days. There's always something that's going to come up. And so then it's a question of what's the relative risk and what do we do with that? So if we can go to the next slide. So this gives you a kind of a summary of what to look for. Is the phase 1 or 2 done to an appropriate standard? We recommend Reg 153 be followed. There are some caveats in terms of Reg 153 and the process there. With respect to time frame, you usually can't get a compliant Reg 153 done in a real estate cycle. So that's generally called a modified CSA or a modified Reg 153 or something like that. One of the other things that you need to look for is the contamination delineated fully or not? Are the reports up to date? The Minister of the Environment in Ontario will not accept a phase 1 or 2 report for their documentation purposes if it's more than 18 months old. So perhaps that's a general kind of time frame that you can start to evaluate the age of your reports. Also, make sure you have use of the reports that you get, at least for your lending institution, if not as a purchaser for yourself as well, so that you can rely on those prior reports. And when in doubt, get some help. That's what we're here for, and happy to feed into that. We can go to the next slide.
Paul, is there typically a fee for a reliance letter? I think just in terms of edification of people listening,
sure.
How does that normally play when you call and ask for, when should you ask for a reliance letter? You know what I mean?
Sure. Our policy is that, of course, if you're the client, you don't need a reliance letter because you're the client. If you're looking for financing, we will provide a letter of reliances to your financial institution for lending purposes at no cost. If you are a purchaser, we will provide those letters of reliance to your financial institution at no cost. Generally, we are hesitant to provide letters of reliance to purchasers because they haven't been our client, and there's issues around conflict of interest. But like everything, that can be a subject of discussion, and we can work our way through that.
Perfect, thanks.
We can go to the next slide. So Kevin and I often talk about what's your exit strategy at the start. So go ahead, Kevin.
I think that the level set is that everybody has heard about a phase 1 or phase 2. It's been pretty standard practice for years. And my premise is really that this environmental due diligence and planning that we're talking about, as I said off the start, almost starts to focus more on the planning and operational side rather than my opening bullet here, which is don't wait for the last minute panic. Have a relationship with someone that works in this field that you can count on. And Paul touched upon a standard of care, and there is a difference with different practitioners on their standards of care. And hopefully you've got a partner that's knowledgeable of your business, your intent, and you don't have to start in a crisis at ground zero. And I think what that means in the middle here is, keeping good records, being organized. And what we're advocating for a lot of our clients is basically an annual review on all environmentals, whether or not, as mentioned on the call earlier, they are interior related or land and building exterior related, but taking good care, thinking beyond transactional emergencies, and planning ahead. So most of it's on the slide there, but again, building good relationships, being organized before you have to react to a situation or, in fact, an opportunity. It doesn't always have to be bad. We can make it good. So next slide.
Just to interject there a bit too, there are some legal requirements in terms of sort of your window of opportunity to go after a tenant or go after if you've sublet your property or something like that. You've got a window of opportunity of 2 years from knowledge of that issue. So if you're in a situation where you have a multi-tenant premises and you're not checking on these things, then you may run into problems from going back against that tenant to try and get things rectified if you're not proactive on that. So there are some reporting issues around that can be helpful in terms of documenting your environmental health of a property.
It's a good point. I didn't know about that 2-year rule. That's excellent.
So as we mentioned at the start, we like to look at creative approaches to environmental issues. Instead of just being knowledge practitioners, we like to look at the application of that knowledge, and that comes through in terms of some of the creative approaches we have to environmental issues. If we can go to the next slide. So those pieces of knowledge, we've touched on them before, and if you see standard of care come up in a number of slides, it's there for a reason. You got to make sure you've got the right kind of knowledge. The next point is that not all contaminants are equal. We tend to deal with 3 different buckets of contaminants. Let's call them petroleum hydrocarbons. So that's like gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, those kinds of things. The second bucket would be metals like copper, lead, zinc. And the third bucket would be volatile organics, and particularly chlorinated volatile organics. So in terms of how bad is a sorry, I just lost my feed for a minute. I'm back. So in terms of the that hierarchy of contaminants, generally, if we find petroleum hydrocarbons, we're not too worried about that, and there's technical reasons for that. If we find metals, we're generally not too concerned about that, although there are some exceptions. But if we find chlorinated organics, and that would be tetrachloroethylene or dry cleaner fluid, or trichloroethylene or a solvent degreaser like you would find in a metals degreasing application, both of which are fairly widespread in the environment. Those are ones that, for technical reasons, have a significant consideration. The next thing is, what's your proposed use? If you're continuing in an existing use and the contamination is contained within your property, then that's it could be as easy as business as usual, and you just manage that risk. But if you're planning a change in use, and particularly if you're going from more intensive use to less intensive use, like commercial industrial to residential, then you trigger some provincial regulations under Reg 153 that require a record of site conditions. So that really changes the game significantly when that condition comes into play. So make sure you're aware of that. I mentioned that contamination on and off site is a significant consideration. And that's because under the Environmental Protection Act, you can be responsible for contamination moving off-site, even if it didn't originate from your operations, and it could just be a transfer through. So contamination at the property boundary is something that that you really have to pay attention to, and make sure you have a management strategy for that. Just because it's there doesn't mean you have to throw up your hands. There are some strategies to deal with that in terms of management options. And then the last point is, what's the owner's sensitivity to risk? Some owners have a very limited sensitivity to risk. Other owners are more open to that, and they can really deal with the property over time. So when you bring that risk characterization into play, then it helps you to focus on the options that are available. If we can go to the next slide. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, so I think what we're going to follow through next is just some examples of creativity and work that has been completed in the past. But again, creative solutions is a pretty wide and encompassing thought. But the bottom line is, with proper intelligence and due diligence and a bit of science, you can come up with a plan, and you don't necessarily need to walk away from an opportunity. So examples of that, the obvious one is, loosely in transaction world, is the haircut. You just come in and take the remediation price or whatever work is required to rectify a situation off the purchase price. Escrow accounts can be used to basically put funds in place until a certain amount of work, identified scope of work is completed. Vendor take back mortgage can work the same way. Other times, maybe it's the opposite, where you just walk in and assume the risk from a knowledge base where you have characterized the building, the land, and all the related off-sites, and just walk in and assume the risk and go forward. Conditional financing. Sometimes a forward sale or a short-term leaseback could work if you're not in a hurry to get into the leased or purchased property. There's other ways to do sort of joint venture promote structures where you could transact today based on things happening and a forward closing. Could be 1, 2, 3, as far out as you want. So we're going to go through some of those examples. I just thought when I was preparing for this, somewhat old school, but it's also happening today, where there are other ways to, if you have a contaminated site, also if no one's been exposed to this before, if it's a larger site, sometimes, Paul, as you know, it's not uncommon, and we've done deals where you basically, if you've got time and you've thought about it in advance, sometimes if it's something as simple as contaminated soil that might be permitting a development or a renovation, you could sever off an adjacent piece of land, bifurcate the property, have a clean site and basically a donor site, which then gets cleaned up all to standard on a separate path, and then you can transact. So there's so many different paths that you could go down, but that's kind of a bit of a list by way of example. So next slide. So kind of a repeat about a little bit on what I just said, and probably what you're going to see on these sample case studies. But again, take away, like, just with the right team, you can resist the temptation to walk away. And, an informed decision about staying or going in a deal is better than one that is driven by just, unsubstantiated risks or fact or uncertainty. You're better to get down to the science of it and get a team that can solve a problem. So, pretty high level, but I think you're trying to change the mindset of how you approach a transaction. So, do you have any comments on those two slides, Paul, before we kind of go into the case studies?
Yeah, I think there's underlying all of this from a technical point of view. There's this, we call it kind of the project management trifecta, right? You can play with time, you can play with money, and you can play with the deliverable. And so in all of these projects, that's what we do. So if you have more time, then that may open up more technical solutions. If you need to, because of deal deadlines, add some more money to the mix, then that can come into play as well. And then in terms of the actual end game, we can also adjust what the how clean is clean kind of argument, right? Just because you're subject to generic conditions as part of an environmental site assessment doesn't mean that those have to come in play down the road. You can use site-specific criteria, which is just as protective of the environment and human health, but does open up more things. So it's that triangle of time, money, and what the end game is. I think that comes into play in all of these projects or approaches.
100% agree. The business drivers running into the deliverable drivers is always the problem. Yes, there's tension there for sure. Okay.
So this particular case study is a project where an escrow was established. If we can go to the next slide. So the site's a manufacturing facility. It's in a mixed neighborhood, residential, commercial, industrial uses. We did a phase one. We were involved with the purchaser of the business. So it was an owner-occupied business where the building and the business was both owned by the same entity. The business was sold, but the building was not part of the package, but it was a lease back. So there were some issues around contingent or continued liability to the operating company. So we were engaged to do a phase one on the property as part of the sale of the business. That came up with the requirement for a phase two. And we found as part of that, although not part of the operating business, the presence of contaminated or chlorinated solvents on site. And that brings up the whole idea is that this operator or this business has been operating at this site for a number of years. In their due diligence, when they purchased the property, they didn't find these chlorinated solvents. And so it was a bit of a surprise when they came through as part of the due diligence package, because it didn't relate to what they had been using the building for. They were actually a very clean operation, but it was the historic uses that are there. So what happened is they came to a conclusion where an environmental escrow was set up of several $1 million and a certain period of time in terms of releasing those funds in order to deal with the contamination. That allowed the business to go on operating, and also for the owner to have, as part of the purchase and sale, the building, the environmental dealt with as part of the building. So there was some value that was created on the part of the owner in that setting as well. So that was a solution that required both kind of the legal, technical side of things to come into alignment with the environmental part of it. Next slide. Similarly, you'll notice that most of these deal with how to finance as Kevin likes to say, a hairy site, one that's got issues. Because those sites are generally difficult to find traditional financing for, we often look to combine the environmental work with non-traditional or slightly different avenues of financing. So this is a vendor take-back mortgage case study. If we can go to the next slide, sorry. Again, it's a manufacturing facility, mixed residential, commercial, industrial uses. We were first engaged to do a peer review on this property, and which had determined that there were volatile organic compounds, again, chlorinated solvents, that had been reported but not delineated at the site. So this was a property where the vendor, again, he wasn't aware of the fact that the property was contaminated. It took him by surprise. There was kind of this continued theme of owner-occupied or owner property that has this undefined liability associated with it. In this case, the purchaser and the vendor came up with a vendor take-back mortgage that was forgivable if they didn't meet certain remediation requirements, as well as the fact that the seller was required to pay for the remedial work. So that has worked quite well, and we're working our way through that particular project as well. Any questions on that? Otherwise, we can move to the next one.
I'll just interject to give you a breath and take you off script a bit. But there was a phrase you threw in there that said reported but not delineated, which is nice scientific language for me to say, well, why, Paul, wouldn't it be delineated? Just out of curiosity, what are the cases where someone is it sticking your head in the ground and saying, I don't want to know, I don't care, or, like a serious question, like not delineated. Just expand on that a little bit, not necessarily on this case, but like how that plays out in the real world, right?
Right. So subsurface delineation, or knowing the extent of the contamination, is a question of, you have to think about the subsurface in terms of 3 dimensions, right? You have both depth and lateral X and Y coordinates, as well as the vertical coordinate. So you have to think about it in three dimensions. So delineation has to happen vertically. So you have to have a clean sample below your dirty sample, so you know how deep you have to go, and you have to know how wide you have to go. We almost always get questions from our clients with respect to how much delineation is required. And if you want to put that in the record of site condition or what the MOE wants, the MOE wants delineation. They want their clean boreholes to within 7 meters of the dirty boreholes. So 7 meters is not very far, somewhere in the range of, let's say, 20 or 25 feet. And that results in a pretty close spacing sometimes when you're trying to find that clean line. So while that may be the regulatory mandated end, we can generally find a solution that's less than that in terms of spacing in order to come up with budgets or approaches or things like that. But generally, in terms of a due diligence, you go into, if you go back to our original phase 1, phase 2, right? You're trying to define areas of potential environmental concern and turn them into turn them into actual environmental concerns. So you're plunking a 2-inch borehole down in a contaminated or potentially contaminated area to find out if it's real or not. So this becomes an iterative process in terms of delineation and comes back and forth. And Adrian's appeared, so that usually means there's a question.
Yeah, we had a question from Tyson McMahon. He's asking, have you ever had any experience with municipalities using this approach when selling contaminated / brownfield? What is the typical approach? What is typically the approach?
The answer is yes. And there's a couple of, we've been involved in one where an industrial property was turned into a school site or an education site. And that particular property, because it was going from a more intense use to a less intense use, required a record of site condition. We brought, three different things to the table in doing that. One is we did a segmented record of site condition, which means we broke the property apart and did different remedial or record of site condition approaches depending on the property. That's something that we use quite often because sometimes the contamination is confined to a certain area. And so you might use a risk assessment kind of approach in one area and a generic approach in another area just to speed things up. So we did that on this particular property where we did two different remedial approaches. We also used ex situ bioremediation as our remedial alternative on that particular property to reduce the cost of remediation because that client had enough time to deal with that. So we brought a couple of things to play. In terms of the public record, if you're a Toronto-based, if you know the Toronto geography, if you're ever driving the Gardiner Expressway, I like to use this example. If you're ever driving the Gardiner Expressway, you'll see a park with a big red concrete canoe on it by the Sky Dome. That park contains all of the contaminated soil from the railway yard that used to be there, and they've constructed that park essentially as a capped contaminated soil cell or landfill, I guess is another term for that, and used risk assessment for that. So they built that into the municipal redevelopment strategy, and we've been able to have conversations about that with our clients who are considering redevelopment as well. It does require generally a fairly large property to do those kinds of things. But if you have a fairly large property and you have some but parkland allocations that you need to meet, then you might be able to come up with some strategies that fit into that kind of a category. So hopefully that addressed that question. If we can go to the next slide. So this really blends into what I just talked about, is record of site condition as a condition of lending. This generally has to do with the transfer of a property from one use to a less intense use. Then it's mandated, and you have no choice. But sometimes, because a record of site condition comes with indemnification from the Ministry of Environment with respect to the contamination, it's a limited indemnification, but it does do that. The other thing about a record of site condition is it gives you a standard of care that's recognized in the province as being, certifying that the area is clean, let's say. So you've met the requirements with a record of site condition, and you don't get into this ongoing discussion with a purchaser about how clean is clean, or, no, I was expecting this, when really that should be the case. And you don't have to deal with those kind of conversations, because you've got kind of this gold-plated endpoint. We've also, this particular case study deals with the RSC as a condition of lending. I would express extreme caution if you're considering entering into an agreement where an RSC is a condition of lending, simply because obtaining that RSC may be more costly than anticipated, and it may outweigh the cost of getting less expensive lending. But if we can go to the next slide. So again, this is a manufacturing facility. Again, it's located in a mixed residential, commercial, industrial area. Again, it has chlorinated solvent groundwater plume. There was quite a bit of vertical and horizontal delineation done and work done, but the owner entered into an agreement with the lending institution to get a record of site condition within 2 years as part of their lending agreement. And in the context of that lending agreement, we were engaged to provide that record of site condition, or do the paperwork for that record of site condition, so that the MOE could provide that. If we can go to the next slide. Ultimately, the documentation was insufficient. The client incurred some additional cost in terms of getting that done. And despite that additional work, we weren't able to get the record of site condition. The costs were too great, and the owner was able to negotiate out the RSC requirement as a condition of lending. So we would suggest that you explore other avenues before you engage in this one, and it does take quite a bit of thought in order to go forward with that.
So the total timeline on this was in excess of 2 years, or probably more?
Yeah, part of the delays were simply the client wasn't as proactive as they needed to be, but which is not unusual. But we could have got the RSC within the 2 years. It was more a cost issue than it was the time frame. But the RSC condition was a 2 year, and then I think they negotiated a year extension on that before it finally fell apart.
And just quickly before you leave this topic, 2 points on the business side. A record of site condition is not a panacea. Like it's not a get out of jail free. Just comment quickly on the implications of once the RSC is in place and you've got the financing threshold looked after, that's one thing. But just comment on the impact on future development, if any, or resale of the site, on, maybe making changes to the building, the related land, or change of use, if you don't mind, just quickly.
Right. So you're getting into those are pretty detailed discussions, but generally with an RSC, you'll have something that's called a CPU that's attached to it, that gets attached to the property. So a CPU is a certificate of property use. So if you've done your homework and you're happy with that, you can say things like, this is industrial. We've got some excess development land and we are going to stay industrial, and we can accommodate that in future work under the CPU without any significant issues. If, however, you've changed the use significantly, you want to go office space or certainly residential, that would reopen the RSC conversation. So you have to be careful about what your use is at the end of the day as part of that RSC, and your purchaser may be coming in with a requirement for a change in use. Maybe it's industrial that now makes more sense as residential or something like that. But in those conditions, they would need a new RSC. The nice thing about it is they have a good body of work to go from already, with well-defined problems or areas of concern, right? So it should make that process easier at the end of the day, but it does require reopening of the RSC.
So that was the soundbite I was looking for. The certificate of property use relevant, and to our theme, well, it's a solution, does come with a little bit of hair on the liquidity and flexibility of the asset going forward. So you're back to how environmental rates relates to valuation, asset value, in essence. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If we can go to the next slide. I think you're taking this one, Kevin, right? So.
Yeah, I can do this. Probably do this pretty easily. So we just go advance to the next one. But the basic deal is that with all the proper science and due diligence done, if you do have, whether or not it's a private corporation or public corporation, if you have someone who is willing to go in and assume the risk of a property, it's not that a cash purchase is on face a quick solution, but it comes with the precondition that you are going to do your homework, you are going to invest the time. And this particular one is an example, and it happens all the time, where the vendor has not done the pre-due diligence for sale, and you walk in with an agreement to purchase and sale, and financing becomes an issue, and fastest way to take that off the table is just with a cash purchase price. But now you're dealing with liquidity and cost issues for identifying all of the environmental issues and coming up with a plan, or at least satisfying yourself with a plan to allow you to use the property. So in this particular case, Paul and his team identified the VOCs, ongoing groundwater issues that were delineated. There's neighborhood issues, there's property issues, or building issues. But if you just go to the next slide, you say, well, why would I do this? And stepping aside from the science, we had a strong enough balance sheet to pay cash. We had a strong enough balance sheet to do the renovation. Speed of the transaction was essential, so we needed to control the site and control the budget. Greenfield build was not an option for a number of reasons, and there was no other buildings available to buy in the geographic range. So Paul and his team moved in. We came up with Paul and the construction team to figure out a master plan and paid cash for the site, renovated the building, and I believe there's trailing risks and liabilities that all have been quantified, and the site is in operation today. So that's, in the interest of time, that's the short report on that. But I think the issue, back to theme, is that with a 0% industrial vacancy in the Greater Toronto area, if not across, the whole province is tight in industrial. And when we're through this pandemic, and as we work through it, properties are hard to find, and these sites, infill sites, are becoming more important, more critical, and the due diligence required is very significant. So go early and be very studious on how you go at that. It's my takeaway. Anything on that one, Paul, before we go to unstuck?
No, just that idea that sometimes in a tight market like this, the asset value actually increases faster than the cost of remediation does. So you can often see a better return by being able to move quicker in the market. So,
very good point. In fact, this one has probably more than almost tripled in value since the acquisition price, and more than justified the environmental expense. Yes.
Yeah. I think
next, there you go.
And next slide. So, in terms of getting unstuck, we've talked about a number of things about what makes a site challenging. Chlorinated solvents are obviously a problem. Generally, the indicator of human health and the environment is based on indoor air quality. So that's an issue that we're always looking at. And then in terms of ongoing site operational needs, if we can go to the next slide.
So if we talk about the science of the challenge, sort of the site challenges, then what makes a project challenging? And if we just leave you with a list here, we could go on, just kind of mindful of the time, but, endless testing kills all deals, and intelligent testing is the answer, is my takeaway. And we run into these problems all the time. Is the team right? Is the scope of work properly thought out? You don't just run out and get a phase 1 and then a phase 2 and then say, okay, I did it. It doesn't quite work that way. So get the stakeholders all aligned on the schedule, the budget, the current use, the future use. What are the near term, long term? Think it through in advance with the end game in mind is my takeaway there. Whether or not you're acquiring or selling, but not doing pre-due diligence on a sale, for example, deep due diligence or a sublease, and taking these things through, all you're doing is setting yourself up for failure. It's my quick takeaway. Next slide.
So there are also some technical solutions to breaking this stuck cycle. They based on, again, going back to this theme of having more knowledge. One of those tools that we use are on-site testing to be able to get that delineation done faster or improve contractor efficiency. So there are a bunch of technical tools that can support the real estate deal as well, this being just one of them. We can go to the next slide. Remedial technologies also fall into that. Things like risk assessment, which is coming up with non-generic numbers for your particular site, risk management solutions. We talked about a segmented RSC, reallocating soil like the park down by Sky Dome, reducing soil volume through screening out the contaminated material. So there's a bunch of technical solutions that we can bring to play to both reduce the cost, improve improve the technical quality at the end of the day. And that includes things like we do a lot of in situ or on-site remedial options as well. Next slide. So
at the end of it all, it boils down, to teaming, and when you look again at all environmental issues in your real estate life cycle. So strong teams vested in ongoing relationships, and like everything else, bigger is not always better. So whether or not it's a one-stop shop, a massive engineering and a full-service firm, or a series of firms that can come together as a cohesive team that have worked together in the past, that's all situational. But good decision making comes from good knowledge and good planning. So the chat box isn't exactly lighting up, but I think we just had one more slide to try on the next slide to just kind of wrap the whole thing up. Paul can weigh in on this and provide any final comments as we wrap up. But the conclusion in terms of what makes a successful operation, acquisition, disposition, you can just absorb this, but I think we touched on all of this over the course of the slide deck, and happy to talk to anybody after. But basically, in summary, understanding the risk and the critical path, having the right team. And again, financing and liquidity pretty much drives everything. Environmental, I think, Paul, over time, well, historically, people did it more out of legislative issues than maybe financing and real estate issues. But I think, we're well past that these days. And it does impact your balance sheet, your operating costs, does impact your acquisition costs, your exit costs. So just something as I'm repeating again, like I am with our customer base, which is something that on a minimum should be looked at every year. However simplistic or complex that needs to be depending on your operation. And one thing we didn't talk about is just the overall impact on the layout. And when I talk about exit strategy, like we've also seen examples where someone says, well, I bought this building and I just assumed I could expand it over in that direction. And it's sort of laughable in our position. In hindsight, we'll go, well, you didn't think about testing that before you bought it, or you didn't think about investing the structure, or someone said earlier, maybe there was asbestos or something. And it's the things you find out after by not being completely in the know end to end on what you're buying or what you're selling that get you into trouble. So again, having good advisors, people you can put on speed dial instead of going out and getting 3 quotes for a phase 1 and 3 quotes for a building inspection. If you have those team members lined up and on speed dial and directly with you or someone else in your team or your organization, if you have those vested alignments put together in advance, it does make life a lot easier. So did that pretty much cover it, Paul? I'm not sure, Adrian, where are we in time? Too close.
Yeah, I think so. We got a few minutes left.
We've got about 9 minutes left. We just had one more question about what lead time we should give for a phase 1 and phase 2 when we're putting up a property for sale.
Yeah, the minimum lead time you need for phase 1s and phase 2s is probably 90 days inside of your due diligence phase. So after your offer has gone into environmental due diligence. The reason for that is the public record searches and of a phase 1 take about 6 weeks. You can cut that down a bit. I think we usually estimate about 5 weeks for ours, although they can be done even faster if they have to be. But you want to define your areas of potential environmental concern and then come up with a plan to deal with that. So even though you can do phase 1s and phase 2s in parallel, they are designed to go sequentially rather than together. So if you build in 4 to 6 weeks for your phase 1 and 4 to 6 weeks for your phase 2, and then dealing with what may come out of that, recognizing that if you find a problem that you may have to even extend that further. So getting these, being able to clear environmental due diligence in, like sometimes we'll get requests for clearing environmental due diligence in like 10 days, and that's unrealistic. And if you can build as much time as possible into that, then that's helpful for you, because if you cut it short, you may be missing critical information.
Or you may be paying a lot more to get the same information.
Yep. Although I think that's a lesser consideration with real estate prices these days. But it's the time frame of just actually being able to get the information that you require. Physically, you can't do that in a very short time period. What do you see, Kevin, on normal due diligence periods?
Oh, it ranges basically between basic due diligence with no complexity, hopefully is 30 to 45 days, right? And if there isn't anything, but inside 30 days is impossible. And I think even in this new environment with work from home and everything, I'm not even sure 30 days is realistic anymore, even on a fast track. There's risks associated with it all.
And so if you're stuck with a 30-day with no extension policy, then you do have to be careful. about that in terms of your environmental due diligence, because you'll run into not being able to quantify all of your issues in that period.
I don't know if this is being recorded or not. I'll make an off-the-record comment or a side comment, which is
recorded and live, Kevin.
Excellent. In this overheated market, I have told people, and I am convinced, only because I've been at this a little bit too long, but there have been a lot of properties that have been acquired, or I think that people have overlooked. Because of the frothy pricing and opportunity to make money, people have overlooked a lot of traditional due diligence that would normally be done. And I think that there is, I would say, a little bit of a lineup of some properties that might find themselves in a problem down the road when this market settles down. Fortunately, because of the increase in land values, it's potentially corrective, as Paul says, that inflation might catch up enough to pay for that. But if you were on the margins at the end and got in and you let your guard down on due diligence, I think you might find some interesting situations raise their head in the next 5-7 years. But that's in the next cycle. But time will tell.
And also, if you do have a property like that, ignoring the environmental due diligence until you come to the end of that cycle is probably not optimal. You have a lot more options if you deal with it right away. So we would always suggest that if you don't have that information, that you go out and get it.
Correct. Don't leave your head in the sand and hope for a sunny day, because it's still there. Right.
Yeah.
I always tell people that they're welcome to buy contaminated property if they want to, but it's a good idea to think about what it's going to look like when they're trying to sell, or when their kids are trying to sell, or end up sticking people with the problem that they purchased.
If you do another seminar like this, I forgot, but I believe that the takeaway that I like, if anyone remembers anything from these slides, because it wasn't printed, was Paul Wilson's project management trifecta: time, money, and deliverable, because that's all we do every day is manage around those three things. So
awesome. Well, that sounds like a good way to wrap up. We're just about at time, so I'll give you guys back 3 minutes of your day, but I just wanted to say thank you for attending our session. We especially want to thank Kevin for joining us today and sharing all of his knowledge. It's been a real fun time working with you. And if you have a moment, if you could please complete the survey that's at the end of the webinar. We'd love to hear what your interests are in the future topics. And thanks for coming again. Have a wonderful and relaxing, safe holiday season, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Andrea. It's great. Bye all. Talk to you later, Paul.
Yep.